Welcome, everybody. My name is Adam White. I'm the director of the C. Boyd and Gray Center for the Study of the Administrative State at George Mason University's Antonin Scalia Law School. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all today to the Gray Center's third annual Capitol Hill Conference titled The Constitution's First Branch, Rediscovering the Legislative Power. Now, this is the third annual conference. The first one, 2 years ago, under the directorship of Naomi Rao. Our conference focused on legislative proposals to change administrative law. The second year, last year, we focused on Congress's power to oversee the ongoing work of federal regulatory agencies. This year we decided to take a look at Congress's own processes and Congress's role as an institution and its role in our constitutional system. And so we're very grateful for all of our speakers today, including Professors Walker and Adler, who wrote the paper that we'll discuss on today's first panel. This paper actually was discussed months ago at a private research roundtable that the Gray Center hosted at the Scalia Law School, where we discussed a variety of papers on the non-delegation doctrine and Congress's general power and practice of delegating power to federal agencies. Most of those papers were discussed at a conference at the Scalia Law School a few months ago. But we thought that this paper was uniquely well suited to be the centerpiece of today's discussion on Congress and the administrative state here on Capitol Hill. So I'm glad you could all join us, and I'm glad that Professors Walker and Adler are here to talk about their paper. Let me introduce both of them and the two commenters, and then we'll begin with the discussion. Jonathan Adler is the Johann Verhey Memorial Professor of Law at Case Western Reserve University's School of Law. He'll correct the mispronunciation on that in a minute. He's also the founding director of the newly announced Coleman P. Burke Center on Environmental Law at Case Western Reserve, an exciting new project, and we look forward to collaborating with them in the years to come. And his co-author is Christopher Walker. Chris is an associate professor of law at the Ohio State University Moritz College of Law, where he directs the law school's Washington, D.C. summer program. He, like Professor Adler, are regular participants in our program, and once again, we're very grateful for this paper and grateful for your coming here to discuss it. Thank you.
Alrighty. Push to talk. You guys hear me all right? How about now? There we go. Great. Well, it's certainly a pleasure to be here. Great to be back at an event with the Gray Center. Great to be back in this building. I just realized walking in this morning that my first summer in Washington, D.C. was in this building 31 years ago. So great to be back. And what I'm going to very briefly do is kind of talk a little bit about some of the conceptual foundation of the paper that Chris and I wrote, and then Chris is going to talk about the operational aspect of it, what in particular we're proposing. The latest issue of National Review, Senator Lee has an article talking about how Congress needs to reclaim its power and about the problems that have arisen from Congress consistently and pervasively delegating authority to the executive branch over many decades, and how, as a consequence, many power that we rightfully understand as legislative is ultimately exercised by the administrative state and by executive branch agencies. In this article, Senator Lee, I think, articulates what is generally the standard critique of why it's a problem when Congress abdicates as much authority as it does, and endorses some of the fairly traditional solutions that certainly policymakers on the right, at least, have endorsed as ways of addressing this problem. Things like the REINS Act, things like the Separation of Powers Restoration Act, as well as addressing specific statutes like the National Emergencies Act. In our paper, our view is that a lot of this conventional critique of delegation and its problem, and then the solutions that are derived from that conventional critique, are inadequate or incomplete. And in many respects, if part of our concern about delegation is the effect it has on democratic governance and the ability to ensure that the power that is exercised by federal agencies is democratically authorized and is consistent with what voters' preferences and the preferences of contemporary policymakers, that too much attention is focused on the question of the breadth of delegation to administrative agencies, and too little attention is paid to the particular concern of time. And that, in our view, one of the things that has been underexplored and underappreciated is that the real problems with the broad delegation of power are not so much that Congress delegates very large questions to agencies, but rather that Congress will delegate broad power to agencies and then not revisit that delegation for years, in many cases decades. And that temporal lag is the real source of the democratic deficit that results from delegation and the real problem that needs to be addressed. And that solution to this, certainly if we're talking about a legislative solution, needs to be attentive to this time lag problem and to focus on that perhaps more than the scope of delegation. Now, why do we think this is a particular problem? Well, if we just think about the nature of principal-agent relationships, there's nothing particularly unusual about the principal in a principal-agent relationship sometimes delegating very broad authority. If you think about the CEO of a corporation will sometimes delegate to underlings small questions, just filling in the details, but will sometimes delegate very broad questions. It doesn't surprise us that Congress in certain areas like national defense will often delegate a broad range of authority to the executive branch. It really depends on the nature of the sort of question that's at issue, the degree to which the principal, in this case Congress, thinks expertise matters, perhaps concerns about how quickly decisions might need to be made. But what's a real concern is that when a principal in, say, 1970 delegates power that's going to be exercised in 1990, in 2000, in 2010, because in that context, not only do we have no assurance that that delegation is in accord with contemporary understandings of what degree of delegation is appropriate or responsible, but we can't even be sure that those who delegated the power in the first place were even aware of what it was they were delegating. So let me give one example. One of the issues that's consumed a lot of oxygen in D.C. in recent months is, or actually I guess in the last couple of years, is the question of net neutrality. I should say right off the bat, I lack the bandwidth to tell you whether I think net neutrality is a good idea or a bad idea. I don't know enough about the specifics of the policy. What I do know is it's a very big policy decision, whether or not something like the Open Internet Order in some form is a good idea or a bad idea. The underlying statutory authority at issue, right, the Initial Communications Act is enacted in 1934. Last time Congress revised the Communications Act was in 1996. In 1996, there was no residential broadband, there was no Wi-Fi, there was no Amazon, there was no Google, there was no Netflix. In fact, none of the technologies or business structures or market structures that are at issue and that underlie the question of whether or not we should have an open internet order were even conceived of, let alone in operation. And yet the power that the FCC purported to use to resolve this question had been delegated in 1996. And so whether we think it's a good idea or a bad idea, whether we think it's what the public wants or doesn't want, whether we think Congress would have authorized this or approved this or not, the reality is that here's an agency using power that was delegated at a time when the questions the agency was trying to address had not even been conceived of. Right? It's not simply a question of, would Congress approve this policy? Would Congress approve of this answer? Congress was not even aware of the question. And that's one example. We can give other examples. We can talk about how this is a way of understanding the dispute or whether the FDA had authority over tobacco that was ultimately litigated in the Supreme Court. We can talk about this in the context of regulating greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act and so on. But we see time and time again the particular problems that arise not merely from broad delegations of authority, but the fact that Congress doesn't revisit those delegations for extensive periods of time. And the last thing I'll note is if we look at the role of the judiciary in this, we know as a general matter, the judiciary has been uninterested or has felt itself unable to police delegations. And if you look at the sort of second best solutions that the Supreme Court has adopted, various canons of construction that are used to constrain delegations, they mostly focus on the question of breadth. Things like the major questions doctrine or the constitutional avoidance doctrine, they don't deal at all with this temporal time lag. And so kind of the underlying premise of our paper is that this temporal lag is a key part of the question of delegation that needs to be on the table. And with that, I'll turn it over to Chris, who's going to talk about what we might do about that.
Great. Did you turn yours off? All right, I'll use Jonathan's. That works. So what do we do about this? Well, the easy or the simple answer is Congress just has to start legislating more, right? They have to regularly legislate. That's not an easy answer. It's a simple one. Congress isn't going to start legislating anytime soon. So what we try to explore in the second half of the paper is what can we do to nudge Congress to legislate more? And we go and we dust off the 1980s and 70s literature on sunset provisions, and try to kind of build on this idea that Congress should return to regularly reauthorizing statutes, especially statutes that govern federal programs and federal agencies. And again, it's still a heavy lift to get Congress to do this, but there's a pretty good roadmap for looking at how this happens in context. It turns out that a lot of agency statutes are actually required to be reauthorized and just aren't, at least not directly. They're reauthorized or at least refunded through appropriations without actually being reauthorized. I don't want to get too much into the weeds, although if there are experts in the room, I'd love to hear more. But when we think about reauthorization today, there are actually kind of two different flavors. One is where a statute actually requires reauthorization itself, so think like the Voting Rights Act. Another is where a statute requires a reauthorization of appropriations. And that's similar, and they're actually quite confused as we've tried to kind of tease out different examples. A lot of these actually end up being examples of reauthorization of appropriations. There is a little bit more, there's not much data at all on reauthorization of organic statutes, but there is quite a bit on reauthorization of appropriations because the Congressional Budget Office has to produce a report annually that lists all of the expired authorization appropriations that have been reappropriated. So for instance, in their 2019 report, they find that there are 971 lapsed authorizations of appropriations, up to $300 billion in money that's going to be reappropriated where the authorization of appropriations is lapsed. Now, Congress has rules in place since the 1900s that suggest that they can't do this, that in order to appropriate, they need to authorize, it has to be authorized under the organic statute. But that's normally not honored, right? They don't try to kind of enforce that. They have to report it out of the Appropriations Committee and say these are the parts that are not authorized that we're appropriating. There's some fun mechanics there which we'll get back to in a second, of at least in the Senate, it seems like if senators wanted to raise a point of order, they might be able to get that through. In the House, it would be more difficult if they wanted to kind of hold up the appropriations process along those lines. But when you're thinking of examples of reappropriations, you've got like the Voting Rights Act and the U.S. Patriot Act as kind of examples of statutes that have to be reauthorized. On the authorization appropriation side, we're thinking much more like the CFTC and the Import-Export Bank as other ones that need to be reauthorized. So I just want to spend a little bit of time on two aspects of the mechanics. The first is the breadth. You have a number of different options on the table if you want to require reauthorization. The most extreme would be just to have a general sunset provision of statutes. Some states experimented with this, just kind of a one-size-fits-all, every statute needs to be reauthorized within X number of years. That's definitely not what we're suggesting. I mean, that would be a disaster on a disaster, and it doesn't take into account the way that Congress can function when it's functioning well through authorizing standing committees, right? But that's on one extreme. I think on the other extreme, you could just require oversight before you reappropriate. Right? And that would be pretty mild, but you could imagine a statute, Congress saying, before the CFTC's gets appropriation, the standing committee that oversees the CFCC at least has to do some type of oversight. So that's minimal. I think it would still actually spur legislative action. I think it's a very modest, incremental approach that we could start using today. If that's something, you could either do that through statute, you could also do that through amending the rules to require that type of oversight. But that's kind of the very, very modest thing. We're most interested in what's in between those. And you can imagine on the breadth side, really thinking about targeting, if you have an agency organic statute, the authorizing committee targeting certain aspects of that. So the whole statute wouldn't sunset for an agency, but you might target certain certain projects or programs within it. And we explore in the paper what we've called sunset defaults. So you're not just sunsetting the whole statute, but you're thinking about what you would revert to if Congress weren't able to come up with a new deal for a reauthorization. And like to give one example, with the Import-Export Bank, when it wasn't reauthorized in 2015, its authorization lapsed for 5 months, it's not that they stopped servicing the loans and financial services products that they had. It's just that they couldn't extend any new loans. They couldn't do any additional, and that was still a huge problem. And if you kind of saw the reauthorization process, that was enough to get businesses to really, really complain and put a lot of pressure on Congress to force them within 5 months to reauthorize it, to pressure. But it wasn't enough that everything fell apart. We kind of explore also in the paper this idea, you might imagine a similar situation with the EPA, where you would shut down all rulemaking, all enforcement, all government enforcement, and the agency would have to kind of stay where they're at, but the regulations on the books would stay in place, private suits would still be there, states could still regulate under it. And so that's kind of another example. For our abolish ICE crowd out there, I could imagine a more targeted reauthorization. Andrew's like, there's no abolish ICE crowd. I think there are. We've got it taped. Come on. I could imagine a more targeted one where if they don't reauthorize, that all enforcement within the United States stops. And similarly, all on the customs side, you have a similar type of kind of poison pill. It's enough to get Congress to act. It's not enough to paralyze the administrative state. And so you kind of move forward that way. So you can imagine either that's in the organic statute that Congress, when they reauthorize, they amend to include provisions that kind of set a sunset default, or a more modest approach would be when they are dealing with authorizations of appropriations, they set what types of funding won't be allocated if the agency doesn't go forward. So there's a lot of questions on breadth. We're not in our paper trying to provide the answer, but we're trying to provide kind of a menu of tools that Congress could consider incorporating into statutes to encourage them to have to revisit statutes on a more regular basis. I guess one other point on that is you'll need to think about timing and how to space that out. I could imagine, a lot of the debates on reauthorization, if they're newer technologies or areas, newer agencies, you might start with, a shorter time frame, like 2-3 years. As you get more experience, or if it's a technology, there's not going to be regulatory, there's not going to be a lot of change. You can imagine kind of pushing that out much longer. And Congress has done that in a number of different contexts where they push the window out further as they become more confident the agency is acting in a way that comports with what Congress wants them to do. All right. I might not spend as much time on how do we actually get this done. I would kind of say 3 things. One, there might be room in the Senate rules today if members of Congress wanted to threaten that money is not appropriated if it's not authorized. 2, you could imagine amending the rules or in the statutes putting things in place to make it clear that things need to be done before it's reauthorized. And 3, and it's probably I think our wildest idea, and maybe it doesn't seem too wild to you, maybe you have judicial review of either in an organic statute recognizing of a party that's been aggrieved has the ability to actually challenge the agency action on the grounds that it was appropriated without authorization. I don't have a lot of time left, but I did want to just speak just very quickly on, so what are the objections? There are lots. I want to focus on 3 and just flag them. The first is this idea of congressional incapacity. Either they lack the expertise or the time. I've never liked the expertise arguments because 1, we can always build up Congress's expertise, and 2, Congress relies heavily on agencies to draft statutes, and so we could imagine agencies playing a very, very important role in this. On the time front, I think that is a serious concern, both floor time and committee time. It's hard to find time if you're doing regular reauthorizations of hundreds of statutes over a 5 to 10 year horizon. That's not an easy task. There are some things we can do. We can learn from other contexts like fast tracking in the treaty context or the Congressional Review Act. Maybe we get rid of the legislative filibuster for reauthorizations. Maybe we limit the amount of time or ability to make amendments on the floor. Maybe we do what they just did with nominees and limit the cloture debate to 2 hours. I think there are a number of different avenues you can do to speed things up. So I'm not as concerned, but that is a cost. The second is Is this just an anti-regulatory agenda that we're pushing? I think the answer is no. I think it's much more complicated than that. It is an agenda where I think, and I think, John, that Congress should be the one that's making the major decisions about how agencies operate, and they should be revisiting those on a regular basis. But ultimately, some of the examples in history actually suggest that this is pro-regulatory. Bill Eskridge has a great short piece where he explains how the Voting Rights Act, for instance, reauthorization, actually ended up expanding the role. If you look at the CFTC, the agency got more powers with every reauthorization. They were given more and more. And so we don't think this is necessarily anti-regulatory, but it is definitely pro-Congress. And we're not kind of shying away from that. And then lastly, and I'll kind of end on this, I'll skip the regulatory uncertainty stuff unless,
Go ahead.
well, so the last one is, well, what about uncertainty, right? If Congress is revisiting a statute every 3 to 5 years, you can imagine the regulated industry being kind of really worried about this, right? Like, things are going to change. They're investing based on settled expectations. And I think that's a problem. I think that's a problem today, though. We've seen agencies with the change in presidential administration do things very differently. Politics are involved in agency rulemaking, as a number of scholars have well documented. It's not that we add more politics by bringing it back to Congress, or that we add more uncertainty. I think in some ways we already have that. If you look at the net neutrality example as one, where I think we flip-flopped at least 3 times, maybe 4 if you count Wheeler's flip-flop in response to Obama. And so I don't see this as a lot of additional uncertainty, but there will be some costs to a program like this. Now, the benefits, I think, are really big. If you care about delegation, you care about Congress playing its role under Article 1. They're also really big because I think it'll improve the relationship between agencies and Congress. I did a report for the Administrative Conference of the United States a few years back where I looked at how agencies draft statutes. And when I got to the USDA, doing my interviews at like 10 or 12 different agencies, when I got to the USDA, I was kind of blown away that while the Farm Bill is not a perfect reauthorization in any sense, the relationship that the agency felt they had with Congress was much stronger because they were regularly reauthorizing, they're engaged. And they felt like the committee understood better the USDA's concerns and the regulatory landscape than they would without a reauthorization. And then the last point I'll just kind of end on is, so we've got the benefits, there are costs, we've got the benefits of Congress playing a more regular role in making sure that agencies are doing what the people want, that agency-Congress relationship is better. And then the last one is just, I think there's a huge Chevron deference issue here. As we're grappling with Chevron deference, for a lot of us that don't think it's unconstitutional but are concerned about where we're going with it, one of the big problems is Congress never revisits these statutes. If Chevron deference is based on a delegation of authority, which I think it is, we have to actually, they actually have to delegate that authority, and if it's a 30 or 40-year-old statute and Congress hasn't even thought about the internet, this is a problem. And maybe I'll just end in the words of Bill Eskridge, when he wrote about this a while back, that I think really kind of captures this problem. He says, one of the realities you have to confront is that when Congress passes permanent statutes instead of temporary or reauthorized statutes, however specific or general they are, Congress sets afloat a ship in an ocean that Congress is not necessarily going to control. The steering of that ship is not done by members of Congress, it's mainly by agencies, with judges often playing an important role. And I think that's really the issue, that Congress should be steering this ship, that the modern regulatory state is important, it brings us so many goods, it drives us forward into a much better future than we'd have without agencies playing a role to help us. But Congress needs to be driving this ship. They need to be making the major decisions, and agencies needs to be acting in a way that's consistent with the current congressional wishes. And I think a reauthorization process would help advance that ball quite significantly.
Well, thank you very much, Chris and Jonathan. For those of you who are interested in reading the paper yourselves, it's available on the main page of the Center's website, on the gray box in the middle of the page. The paper is called Delegation and Time, and it's also, I think, atop the list of our working papers page on the website, so you can read it for yourself. Now, 2 people who have already read it are our commenters for today, and we'll begin with Sarah Bender. Sarah is a senior fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institution and a professor of political science at George Washington University. She's the author of many books and articles on Congress and legislative politics, including, most recently, a fascinating study on Congress and the Federal Reserve titled The Myth of Independence: How Congress Governs the Federal Reserve, published in 2017. Sarah, thanks for joining us today.
Sure. See if this, we're good? Okay, excellent. Well, first, thanks very much for including me. This is, as we've gotten a glimpse of already, a very interesting and I think thought-provoking paper. And I think the authors have put their finger on a underappreciated dimension of legislative stalemate. That is the failure to legislate and to rigorously upkeep or update laws, and that those failures have consequences for the power of unelected bureaucrats in governmental agencies. As they've just summarized, right, long after legislative coalition has evolved or dissolved, the power they delegated in statute to agencies remains on the books for agencies to exploit, potentially in ways counter to the preferences of the lawmakers who wrote the law in the first place, as you term it, a democratic deficit. I have 5 observations about the paper and argument. First, I think the paper and this panel generally and the conference today are a good reminder of the value of breaking down disciplinary barriers. There's really a lot to be learned by this cross-fertilization, certainly across legal scholars and political scientists who, especially those who study legislative politics. I think what is striking in this vein is how much of your argument touches on issues of concern to students of Congress and the bureaucracy and rulemaking. And as I'll mention in a minute, those studies do have implications, I think, for how we should think about the democratic deficit that you identify, and vice versa. Political scientists don't typically engage with the normative implications of our theories or our empirical findings. We used to, but not so much anymore. And so your focus on Congress's failure to reauthorize programs, I think, raises good and important normative questions about basically the consequences of legislative inaction that behooves legislative scholars to open our minds to. Second, I think I would like to know a little bit more about why this particular democratic deficit is worth study. There are, of course, lots of democratic deficits in our political system, even without ever leaving Congress. Not to speak ill of the Senate and the Hart Building, but there is, of course, a very malapportioned Senate with vast disparities in voting power compared to population. Add in the filibuster, which turns that notion of supermajority rule sort of on its head. And of course, we can find democratic deficits within governmental agencies. New book, Rachel Potter, just this month. She looks at how bureaucrats exploit tools to protect their rulemaking from political interference. And obviously, you don't aim to write about all of these deficits, but I think the paper might make more plain why this particular democratic deficit commands our attention. Third, and this is a little more speculative, and I'll just throw this out there, I always wonder whether the loss of congressional power to agencies, is this a zero-sum game? When Congress decides at time 1 to delegate an authority to an agency to do X at time 2, does the bureaucracy necessarily gain power? Or do other branches then find themselves writing rules without a clear, or as you say, immediate statutory basis? Does that make the agency perhaps more vulnerable to judicial intervention? I don't know the answer, but I think we typically assume that the exercise of delegation of power between the branches is necessarily zero-sum. I win, so you lose, or in this case, Congress loses, and so the agencies win. But I'm not so sure that that's necessarily always the case. It's also plausible that when I lose, we all lose, right? Why? Because ultimately, Congress's imprint could confer some legitimacy when the bureaucracy writes rules. And without that, perhaps it puts the whole enterprise at risk. Fourth, I think the concept of deadlines, and more specifically, as you point out, expiring deadlines that come with temporary authorizations, I think that's an important point for all of us to think about and deserves a little more consideration. I read your paper to suggest that Congress should use sunset provisions more often as a mechanism of forcing action to reauthorize the statutes. And that might be true. A measure with a sunset provision might be more likely to be reauthorized. It's also possible that that relationship might be more conditional than you set out in the paper. And I think I'd like to know more about the conditions under which having a sunset provision does that become action forcing as a deadline. My hunch is that not all expiring deadlines generate action. It probably depends, right? The conditionality. I think the parties probably ask themselves, what are the consequences of inaction? Does it matter if we just let it expire? And as you point out, there's a certain class here where we have hundreds of unauthorized appropriations every year. In general, I think we know that both parties have to think they'll be worse off if they don't go to the bargaining table. They have to think they're going to be blamed for inaction to motivate them to negotiate, right? And so think about the annual defense authorization. I think it's the case that Congress has always reauthorized the annual defense authorization since it became an annual, right? It used to be permanent. Now, probably decades ago, it was turned to an annual authorization. But why, right? It's not the fact that it's an annual authorization that spurs action on Congress's part. It's probably because neither side wants to shoulder the blame for killing the defense bill. More or less the same for the Farm Bill. Tends to pretty much get done every 5 years. Why? Well, some of it is certainly the pressure of farm groups and perhaps the malapportionment of rural areas and their influence in the Senate, but also because the reversion point, like what happens if you don't renew the Farm Bill, I think it is that some obscure 1940s agriculture law that nobody wants to live under and no one wants to be blamed for becomes policy. Other areas, highway, education, State Department, foreign aid, right, can take years before the parties, if ever, feel enough heat to reauthorize them, if ever. There's a really interesting book in this angle, Adler Wilkerson, roughly Congress and the Politics of Problem Solving, where they tackle this issue of unevenness across sunset and authorizations. One other point about deadlines is action forcing in Congress, and I think you recognize this in the paper, that the sunset provisions themselves are endogenous to the politics of Congress, right, that generate the bill in the first place. Maltzman and Shippen article about a decade ago on the durability of law make the point that the more conflict and disagreement in writing the bill, the more likely one coalition will demand and get a sunset provision put into the law, right, as a price for their support for the law. So sunset provisions might be more common, say, when we write laws and when we ever write laws in divided government versus unified control. But it's not clear to me that including the sunset provision makes future revisions necessarily more likely, right? Do sunsets beget future sunsets, which seems a little metaphoric or philosophical or picturesque, but it's also an empirical question, right, amenable to testing. And I don't know that I've quite seen it tested in that way. So overall, I'd say that the politics of sunsets and the conditions under which they're more likely to generate action deserve, as you single out, right, deserve more empirical, let alone theoretical attention. Finally, that would be fifth, I guess, there's an assumption in the paper, I think, about the causes of legislative stalemate that I'm not so sure about. And I think it doesn't do harm to your argument. I just pointed out for future revisions. Page 25, presumably legislators would legislate if that was their preference. That is, if members of Congress believe that the benefits of regular legislating outweigh the costs, then that's how they would behave. But as you point out, demands on time and alternative interests, legislators choose not to legislate on a regular basis. I'm not so sure. I think I would just say that preferences alone, and bracketing what do we mean by preferences, but preferences alone probably aren't sufficient to generate congressional action or to explain when we see Congress act and when we don't. First, Frances Lee's work, you'll hear from her later today. In today's partisan system, there are nearly always competing electoral incentives that can make action, raise the barrier to legislative action, even on issues that both parties agree are a problem, right? Immigration reform. There's not a lot of disagreement that there's something should be done, and yet preferences alone aren't sufficient. Second, rules of the game matter. Preferences probably aren't enough. Clear as example, as you've pointed out, on Senate debate rules requiring supermajorities for action. So I don't think it's so much that lawmakers choose not to act, it's that on many issues, majorities can't always act under the rules of the game. But when I say can't act, I mean they aren't willing to take the type of tough votes that would get to the large supermajorities that are required, especially in a bicameral setting. So where does this leave us? I think you've put your finger on a very important problem, and it's important along theoretical, substantive, and normative dimensions. And so the questions you raise, I think, deserve more theoretical and empirical attention, both from legal scholars and from political scientists. And that a project like this, which gets us out of our silos, including my own, that's always a great thing. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Sarah. So our second commenter today is Philip Wallach. He's a senior fellow in governance at the R Street Institute, where he studies and writes on the relationship between Congress and the administrative state. Previously, he was a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute. In 2015, he authored a great book titled "To the Edge: Legality, Legitimacy, and the Response to the 2008 Financial Crisis." Philip, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Adam. And it was an authorized book. It was not an unauthorized. I want to go back to where Jonathan Adler started first, and he was relatively diplomatic, and I want to be a little less diplomatic. So Senator Lee recently wrote this very well done piece in the newest National Review, and I think the way Jonathan put it is that this is sort of a pretty standard conservative account of what Congress needs to do, as sort of the kinds of things that you hear at Federalist Society and events and so on. It also has a brief for automatic CRs, which is a little disappointing, but I'll leave that aside. Anyway, I think a great thing about this paper is it invites us to say, hey, maybe this kind of standard conservative menu of things that we should do to get Congress going isn't going anywhere. And maybe obsessing too much about delegation as a universal evil that we are hoping to somehow reverse is not really going anywhere. And maybe we should think more about what makes delegations healthier or less healthy, and think about the democratic deficit issues on other dimensions. And this paper gives us one really important avenue for doing that, which is just thinking about Congress's ongoing involvement with its statutes, with these ships that it sets afloat. The problem may not be sort of the marginal expansions of delegation of the sort that Reins would address by having Congress have to vote on every marginal expansion. At this point, the much bigger issue is this huge reservoir of power that has been already created, and the ongoing congressional passivity in relation to that reservoir of power, where Congress isn't really forced to involve itself with the operation of that power. And so I think Chris and Jonathan are giving us a really good look at one way Congress ought to lessen its passivity and become more active in engaging that. Why does that matter? Well, power abhors a vacuum. We know that if Congress isn't the one doing the steering, it's going to be unelected bureaucrats. And a long time ago, in a part of my dissertation that I turned into an article called "When Can You Teach an Old Law New Tricks?" I sort of tried to think about, well, why is it that courts are going to allow bureaucrats to do this? And basically the thesis of that article is that courts are very sensitive to whether Congress is trying to fill this vacuum or not. And if they're not, courts are likely to be significantly more deferential. So that was my reading of FDA versus Brown and Williamson, for example. It's often talked about as this major questions exception to Chevron, that if there's a really big question, well, then courts are going to say Congress has to be the one to undertake that. But to my mind, it was just as important to the majority in that case that Congress was really on the job of regulating a lot of things about the tobacco industry. They were creating this whole regime of regulation around tobacco. It didn't seem like it was something that was just slipping through the cracks that, oh, by the way, they meant to have more or less outlawed by the Food and Drug Act. That seemed sort of a bridge too far, even if there were some plausible textual readings that could put you in that direction. It seemed like Congress sort of was on the case. Contrast that with Massachusetts versus EPA about a decade later. In that case, Congress had directly addressed climate change when it did its 1990 Clean Air Act reauthorization and amendments, and it had decided not to do anything about climate change at that point. But that was all the way back in 1990, and pretty much Congress had just spun its wheels on climate change issues between then and the mid-2000s when that case took place. And to my mind, it was very important to the majority in that case that they couldn't really say, well, Congress is on this case. So since it wasn't, they said, well, all right, EPA, you better get on the job. So I think getting Congress to be constantly engaging things is also a way of getting courts to sort of take the limits of statutory language more seriously because they see it as more appropriate. So tax law was another good example of this, where Congress is very involved in tax law, and courts tend to be rather strict interpreters of tax law as a result. Okay, so that's why this is all important, and I think reauthorization is a very good avenue to pursue to get Congress more involved. But let's say we're sold on that. I want to spend the rest of my remarks just sort of emphasizing how hard it is to actually create these incentives that Chris and Jonathan want to set up. And some of what I'm saying, Sarah already said in a different way, but it's very hard to put in place self-executing rules of any kind in Congress because both chambers, at the end of the day, are majoritarian bodies that govern their own arrangements, and so are totally free to waive their own rules whenever they want to, and they do. That is a familiar feature of how Congress operates. On the face of it, it seems like there's already rules in place that they cite chapter and verse for that say if something isn't reauthorized, it doesn't get appropriated for. That's not enough self-executing because those get waived. I think, in other contexts, they use this phrase that I haven't seen for a little while called statutory hammers. This used to show up in the political science literature a fair amount. The idea is sort of putting in place something that bops you on the head if you don't do something, and that's going to get it done. But to my mind, the most famous hammer was this thing called the Medicare sustainable growth rate that we used to have, that basically said automatic cuts are going to kick in on Medicare. But what did that do? It induced this every single year thing called the doc fix. And it wasn't a scandal that Congress passed the doc fix. Indeed, it was seen as a moment of panic. What if they wouldn't? But they always did. Congress is really good at kicking the can down the road if that's what it wants to do. Stalemate notwithstanding, those were some of the most reliable bipartisan actions for many years. And then finally, we just got rid of the whole charade. And everyone breathed a sigh of relief. Aren't we glad we're done with that nonsense? And the original purpose of sort of holding ourselves to account was sort of just mostly forgotten about. Just a few scolds mentioned that. I think that makes it tempting to go with the sort of more draconian kinds of things where you put it right into the law. I thought that there was an interesting idea in their paper that you could actually have it right as part of the organic statute, that if this is not authorized, it cannot be appropriated for. That would not be a rule that could just be waived then. Of course, you can still just add a little amendment to the appropriations bill that does the work, I think. But there is a temptation to reach for the bigger sunsets. So there was, for example, Representative Steve King had worked up an idea that the whole Code of Federal Regulations ought to be sunset over a 10-year period. And that was actually attached to the version of Reins that passed the House of Representatives in the 115th Congress. So had that become law, Congress would have had to go through the entire CFR and repass anything that it liked, that it wanted to keep on the books, or else at the end of that time, it would have just become null and void. So whereas, I think Chris and Jonathan are very sincere in saying that this is not part of, their paper is not part of an anti-regulatory agenda. Pretty clearly the Steve King idea that we should just sunset the whole Code of Federal Regulations, that was part of a sort of a pretty blunt anti-regulatory agenda. And that managed to get, the Republican caucus to endorse it in the House. I think it's really important to steer away from those things and to say this enterprise of sunsetting and getting Congress to involve itself on a regular basis is a very much a bipartisan thing in the institutional interests of this place. We need to be sensitive to the concerns that this is all some sort of stealth anti-regulatory thing, because that really has the potential to poison the politics, which really ought to be run on sort of institutional lines. All right, I'll leave it at that.
Well, thank you, everybody. I have just a couple questions before we turn it over for audience questions. But I want to pick up where Philip left off on the question of Congress's incentives. Obviously, the situation we have now, which you're sort of critiquing and proposing an alternative to, we didn't get here on accident, or at least not just by one accident, right? We arrived at this point because of a series of incentives and historical events. And so how do you change the incentives of Congress to actually pursue the reform path that you've sketched out? Is it something that can be done within Congress, or does it require external shocks from, say, the courts, which you sort of hint at a little bit in some places, I think? But what do you think?
I mean, I'll start. It's a good question. I mean, I think that there is growing appreciation within the legislature that its ability to be the first branch has been eroded, and there's, I think, a lot of question about what to do about that. Certainly, external shocks can be helpful. I think one thing in terms of thinking about this is it's certainly easier, it's a relative matter, to get a legislative body to commit today to making a hard decision in the future than it is to commit to making the hard decision now. And we see examples of this. I mean, some of the stock examples that people point to, the base closing commissions, the way fast track authority is handled, right? Those are, the whole basis of those mechanisms is that Congress recognizing that it is easier to commit to following a certain set of rules somewhat behind a veil of ignorance about precisely whose interests are going to be at stake than it is to make the actual decision about, which congressional districts lose their military bases or which interests are most affected by a trade agreement. And so part of our pitch is for Congress to see these questions in somewhat of those same terms, that just saying to Congress, well, just go reauthorize stuff, isn't likely to accomplish much. But saying to Congress, think about choices you can make today such that it will be harder to avoid reauthorizing in the future, that isn't as dependent upon a crisis or so on. And then I think questions about what that looks like become more important. I think one of the lessons of the doc fix example that Phil mentioned is that if the consequences only fall on a narrow set of constituencies, that the way what we're talking about would play out is very different than if it falls on a broader range of constituencies. And so if it's just, well, one particular interest group is not going to get the money that it's used to, well, then the question just becomes, is that interest group powerful enough to get Congress to fix it on a rolling basis the way doctors are? If it instead is a broader structure is frozen in place that cuts in multiple directions, well, then that creates a very different dynamic. So I'll just throw one example out as a thought experiment. Let's say the Clean Air Act has not been reauthorized since 1990. Let's say a consequence of that was not that the statute is erased from the books, not that regulations that have gone through the relevant notice and comment process are no longer operative in the CFR, but let's simply say that until the power that Congress granted to the EPA under the Clean Air Act of 1990 is reauthorized, EPA has no prospective power to act with the force of law under that statute. So it can't issue new regulations, it can't issue permits, it can't initiate its own enforcement actions. Citizen suits, Sierra Club, Earth Justice, they can still file citizen suits seeking to enforce existing statutory and regulatory restrictions. States can continue insofar as they have previously been delegated authority to enforce those provisions. But it means that the wide range of constituencies that are unhappy with that status quo being frozen in place would all have an interest to come to the table. Right? Environmental groups certainly would be interested in the EPA being able to continue to be able to promulgate new regulations, to continue to initiate new enforcement actions. The regulated community would certainly have an interest in the EPA's ability to authorize new permits because of the exposure, the citizen suit and exposure that failing to have valid permits on a continuing basis would, the risk that presents. The ability of companies that need new permits for modernization of facilities and the like, right? So that cuts across a wider range of interests than the Medicare example that Phil pointed to. And I think that dynamic is different in the sense that it would produce a lot of different interests to want to come to the table and say, okay, what is most important to us? And in effect, it's a way of recreating the dynamic that led to the Clean Air Act amendments of 1977, the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990. And if you look at those, there were aspects of those reauthorizations that were pro-regulatory. There were aspects of those reauthorizations that were less anti-regulatory or more market-oriented. And in fact, they represented the sort of legislative compromise on a big set of questions that we expect that satisfy some groups more than others, or satisfy different groups in different ways. And however much we may criticize that result, given our ideological priors in a particular instance, that is in many respects the way the legislative process is supposed to work, that everybody gets some of what they want, but doesn't get all of what they want. And however much I'd be happy to criticize that, I much prefer a system in which Congress is at least doing that work and reaching agreements and deals that we can then say we like or dislike in various respects, than Congress simply abdicating and saying, we're not going to revisit a major piece of legislation that has vast effects across the economy for 30 years at a time, even though technology and market structure and so on are rapidly changing in the interim. That was a long answer to a lot of things.
Well, Sarah, do you have any thoughts on this? I mean, you already touched on it. You already touched on this a little bit in your own comments, but how did we get to this point? I mean, how is it possible to create the incentives to get Congress out of sort of cul-de-sac that Chris and Jonathan find them in? I save the easy questions for commentators.
I don't think there's a magic wand here. I mean, part of it is the sheer size and scope of the federal government and programs that have been put in place over a roughly 100, but not quite right, say 100-year period. And those are just the sheer scope, right, I think is probably beyond Congress's ability to change their behavior to make them more readily, more routinely reauthorize. I think Jonathan's point about we do have models here of base closing commission, and I think the question for all of us is what are the conditions that make those solutions, that lawmakers are amenable to those solutions, and even in the base closing commission, that process has really broken down, right? The consent that was necessary on both sides, that everybody realized that you could avoid blame if you deferred it and gave away that power, and then structure the closings in a way so that you could reject the whole list, right? All the decisions that went into that law, that process is broken down because of perceived partisanship and how it was implemented, and that may be unique to the policy area. I think it's probably more endemic to the question here of how polarized in terms of the antagonism between the parties and the suspicions about how they're using the reins of power. So it's not and I think we all know, right, as you've all said, it's not an easy problem here, and maybe these piecemeal solutions are, right, is what's the only alternative.
I think I agree about, it may be in some ways more helpful to go major statute by major statute than it is to take on the whole problem all at once. Because, I mean, reading from your paper, you're talking about the CBO's reporting. In its March 2019 report, CBO identified 971 expired statutory authorizations of appropriations with more than $300 billion for which Congress had appropriated funding for fiscal year 2019. Well, in some way, that's not the picture of a crisis at all. I mean, that's the picture of something that's just become business as usual, that sort of, gets its finger wagging in this annual CBO report, but that nobody much cares about. So asking Congress to sort of say, all together, let's take on this whole problem, it almost seems like you're trying to get them to see something as a problem which they just see as their way of getting along with their jobs at this point. I'm not sure that that's so likely. But, there were actually moments of, you had No Child Left Behind, which I think its original authorization from when it was passed in 2001 only lasted until like 2008 or so, something like that. And then it was running unauthorized. And oh, by the way, the statute was a big disaster in terms of its actual substantive provision. So that started getting treated like it was a real crisis. And it took a long time even within that mindset. But finally, Congress did pass a big reauthorization that changed some of the most problematic features of that in right after Paul Ryan became Speaker. And there was I think Congress isn't totally without the ability to do some of this work. So I think part of the question is which statutes sort of the democratic deficit has become most obnoxious, and focusing specific targeted campaigns on those.
Just one more question. I share sort of your sense that it'd be good for Congress to be more actively legislating, taking a greater sort of ongoing role in policy making. So I'm attracted to the proposal. On the other hand, I also want Congress to legislate carefully. And I wonder what's the context in which Congress would be legislating more carefully, just in picking the words. If they're legislating laws that they know from the start are going to expire after 10 or 20 years, or if they're legislating laws that they think will be on the books once and for all until the entire process can be motivated to return again. Isn't another downside of your proposal, it might actually lead to more glib legislation because the stakes will be lower?
Yeah, Adam, let's just try to get them to legislate first. I definitely agree with kind of some of the themes of both what Sarah, with respect to both what Sarah and Philip are saying about, like, our proposal is not something that Congress is going to just do tomorrow for fun, right? I think it will require a pretty big popular electoral or shift in how Congress views itself. I think our proposal is once Congress does decide to actually start being Congress again, this is a tool to make sure that Congress continues to do that going forward, that they should really embrace. And I think Sarah's points about there are so many unknowns here, both theoretically and empirically, are true, and we need to water down the paper a lot to make it really clear that we don't have the answers. We're really just trying to kind of put a flag in the ground to say this needs to be something that scholars are looking at more. I do think the one missing part in the paper that just hasn't been, it's not in this draft, it's elsewhere because it's not in good enough shape even to put in this really rough draft, are the stories, right? I mean, I think the more you show Congress, here are 12 examples of how you've been doing this with some successes and some failures. I hope that'll help to provide a little bit more of a roadmap of that. I mean, answer Adam's question, my guess is that if it's temporary legislation and not permanent legislation, you're going to have narrower delegations of authority, maybe? I don't know. Like, I actually don't know what the answer would be. I would guess if you're thinking it's permanent legislation, Congress might want to delegate a lot, actually, and say, because this isn't going to change. I don't know. I mean, you could imagine different stories in different contexts. Philip's giving me the look like he has a different take, but I actually don't know what the answer would be. Whether they're going to be sloppier or I mean, I don't know. Yeah.
I've just never been convinced that Congress is capable of thinking decades out.
Yeah.
Like, I just don't know that it changes their calculus.
So I will tell you, though, from having interviewed all these agency legislative councils, they do. I mean, one of the consistent themes I had from those interviews of what do you view your role in providing, and this is more technical drafting assistance. So this is Congress-initiated legislation that the agency is providing feedback on, not agency-initiated legislation that doesn't even exist anymore, but used to, where the president would push. And one of my main themes was long-term, right? Maintain regulatory flexibility, make sure that Congress isn't doing anything to be able to kind of limit the agency's ability to respond to future concerns. I mean, I actually think the career folks at agencies think quite long-term. And if they're involved in this process, which they will be, because Congress doesn't have the capacity to, if they're a reauthor, I mean, they're going to have to play a major role. You will have that kind of that long-term view. I don't know how ultimately Congress has to pass the statute, right? I don't know if they'll accept all the changes that agencies suggest, but you all get that long-term view, I think, through the career folks at agencies.
If I could just underline that, something on that real quick, is that, I mean, Chris's work on the Farm Bill shows that, but the experience with sunset laws at the state level does suggest that it's not merely the legislature's behavior that gets affected, it's the administrative agency's behavior that gets affected. And part of that is increased responsiveness and engagement with the legislature, which insofar as we think agencies are the primary repository of a certain degree of expertise for a lot of these questions, is something we want. That is, the agency just being more engaged with the legislature and vice versa, beyond the kind of oversight hearing dramas that are, in many instances, the primary interaction between some agencies and legislative committees.
Can I just add one kind of wrinkle on this? One of the fascinating things is when agencies are most involved now is through the appropriations process, and it's not the same set of people at the agencies that do that. There's not communication between the authorizing, the regulators and the budgeters, and that's a real big problem. I mean, one answer is to make it more, use appropriations to do all this. That's not our answer. But it is interesting to see that where a lot of their interaction with Congress happens is when they're trying to reappropriate. And I don't think that doesn't involve the agency folks that I would want to have involved at the table. So,
Sarah, you want to jump in?
I was just going to add in this question about whether or not the length of the reauthorization could affect how Congress thinks it writes the law in the first place. I would just encourage us to step back and think about the era when we had many more of these permanent authorizations, right? 1940s, roughly 1940s, 1950s, 60s, right? Written by large Democratic majorities, or large or not, but Democratic majorities that really never anticipated losing control of the Congress. And if that's the case, you're a little less worried about giving a long leash to agencies. But in a period of electoral change or consternation between the Congress, a Democratic Congress and a Republican White House in the 70s, and more constant change today, right? This is the point about the endogeneity of the sunset in the first place, that you want to lock in a certain set of outcomes to prevent the other party when they get in control. And one way to do that is to put the sunset in even if, as we know now, they don't go back and always reauthorize. So it's a little hard to know how much work would be done by a shorter authorization versus, is that just reflecting the conflict that's in writing the bill in the first place? But they're tough theoretical questions, but they're important ones, as you pointed to. So
there's a really fun, like, reflective piece by, I think former FTC Commissioner Lucan, is that Philip? Is that how you say his name? That kind of reflects on the agency response to how long the reauthorization. So he has this thing there. He's like, hopefully someday we'll get to be like the SEC, where our reauthorization doesn't happen as often and it's not as controversial. Like so they view it as like earning trust from Congress. Like, if we're really doing what we're supposed to be doing, then we're going to have an easier path, more of a rubber stamp. I don't know. So it's interesting to think about the agency incentives too, on how long is the reauthorization, how much is involved in it. So yeah.
That reminds me of after Congress created the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau with its own sort of separate funding stream. Suddenly you had, I think that was the chairwoman of the SEC and the chairman of the CFTC out, like, giving statements saying, we would like this too. Who wouldn't? Okay, well, we have plenty of time for audience questions. There's a microphone in the audience, so if you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand. We'll call on you and the microphone will find you. We'll start here in the middle of the room. I guess there's two microphones. It's coming right there, sir.
Matt Lawrence from Penn State Dickinson Law. This was a really fascinating presentation, so thanks a lot, and I have a lot of questions, which I will not ask, and comments, which I will not ask. My question is about how your proposals would impact internal dynamics within Congress, and whether those internal dynamics, like between leadership and different committees or among committees, whether those dynamics might be one of the determinants of Congress's will or lack of will to act. And to give you like an example, I'm wondering about, picture a situation where maybe an appropriations committee does wield effective influence over an agency, maybe like USDA, and USDA is very responsive. Would insisting on reauthorization of the underlying authorization provision thereby trigger involvement of a substantive committee and leadership and actually slow the whole thing down and you lose congressional influence? And how would, maybe that's totally speculative, maybe it's not though, and so hence my question about how your proposals would influence these internal dynamics.
Yeah, I mean, one thing, and Naomi Rao, when she was director of the center, did a paper pointing out that one of the things that's an underappreciated consequence of delegation now is it's not simply Congress transferring power from the legislative branch to the executive branch, but it also alters the distribution of power within Congress itself. So part of her argument is that the collective Congress as an entity loses power, but that committee chairs and certain subcommittee chairs actually gain power. And so it's true, already the way we deal with delegation does affect the distribution of power within Congress. My own view is we probably need to think a little bit more about how our proposal itself reallocates power within Congress. I mean, certainly one example would be, as a relative matter, appropriations committees or subcommittees would have less relative power vis-a-vis authorizing committees as a consequence of our proposal than they do now, and that certainly would affect, the willingness of members of those committees to support such a change. There may be some others that we'd have to play out.
Yeah, I'm definitely not a pro-appropriations committee running Congress, so I'm happy with that. I'm happy to have some of the costs of agency responsiveness go away to appropriations committees if it means oversight committees are playing a larger role. I'm a collective Congress person, I think, when it comes to.
So that's and just a quick follow-up, so if there were a choice that was Congress has much more influence, but it's subsets of Congress, versus agencies have much more influence and Congress is just not involved, you would tend to maybe favor the agencies instead of, how would you tier that? Agency influence, all of Congress influence, or subsets of Congress influence? What's your kind of preference ranking of those three sorts of outcomes?
I'm not sure we'd agree.
We might have to confer. We might disagree on that. I mean, I would prefer subsets of Congress as an initial matter, right, in the sense that, so it's not, because our claim isn't that Congress shouldn't delegate. Our claim is that when Congress delegates, we should be more concerned about the dead hand control aspect of delegations that persist over long periods of time, right? That if you think really seriously about the agency literature, not agency as in administrative agencies, but agency in terms of principal-agent relationships, there certainly are contexts in which broad delegations of authority by a principal to an agent are rational and can be responsible. It's harder to come up with instances in which such broad delegations over extended periods of time beyond time horizons that are at all, that one can see beyond. It's hard to come up with contexts in which that's responsible. And so that, I think, is the problem we're most focused on. It's inevitable, given the way Congress itself delegates power within Congress, that any set of policies Congress adopts is going to result in some degree or some lack of uniformity of power within Congress. I mean, that's somewhat inevitable. I think we would agree on our suspicion of the appropriations committees, and generally think that it is good to divide the check cutting power from the substantive power. That division is a good thing, and insofar as our proposal might help restore a better balance in that regard, it's a good thing. But yeah, committee chairs are going to be more powerful than the average member of either body. I mean, that's going to be true.
Philip?
I mean, there is a proposal out there now that the way to settle this dominance of the Appropriations Committee over the importance of the oversight committees is get rid of the Appropriations Committees and say, other committees, now you are not only overseeing these various programs, but you also are the ones that determine how they get funded. I mean, that would be a very radical idea. You do hear that idea percolating a little bit now, coming out of some members' mouths. But I think there's some reason. At the biggest level, you could say, well, maybe the check writers have sort of become this dominant power, and what they really do is mostly play around at the margins, but in ways that make lobbyists really get very excited. So that's where all the money goes in Washington to influence those marginal decisions in the Appropriations Committee. But in some ways that doesn't really get at the democratic deficit, right? It seems like that's the ultimate insider's game, and we're not doing it. Doesn't attach to this deeper work that might happen in the other committees, and meanwhile the work that does happen in the other committees doesn't feed anywhere. So I think the fact that idea is now getting talked about a little bit shows you that there is interest in this way of thinking about it.
Great. Any other questions? Sure. We have two in the back, and then we'll have one up here. We'll start with the one in the middle back, and then on the right.
Testing. Elon Sykes with the Climate Leadership Council. So I heard sort of two pathways to implement or test these sort of ideas on sunsetting. One was popular electoral test. Another was sort of the judicial branch exercising oversight. But I was wondering whether the executive might be a path to exploring this. We've seen the current administration's attempts at regulatory reform or deregulation sort of flounder in the courts because of their process. And I was wondering whether an executive interested in reforming regulation could say, sort of, we won't issue new rules or new enforcements unless Congress revisits this. And maybe that strategy wouldn't happen in divided government, but it's not that the regulatory reform attempts were more successful in a unified government. So,
yeah. So I left that out of the enforcement mechanism. Another would be in the statute to instruct agencies that they cannot not act on anything where they don't have authorization, right? Which would allow, I think, an OIRA type review, an OMB type review, to really play a role there. I get that's another thing. I do worry, ultimately it'll be up to Congress to undo that, and it's not too hard to undo that, but there is that, right? Now maybe you're suggesting that maybe the Trump administration should announce tomorrow that they're going to do this. They'd have a hard time, I think, as a matter of statutes, just the way that Congress has reappropriated and the way agencies understand their role. And that's definitely not my project, or I don't know if that's Jonathan's project. But yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to say, there's also, in a lot of statutes, you do have action forcing mechanisms, so that may hamper the ability of the executive to make that sort of commitment, right? Use the Clean Air Act as an example. The EPA can't just say, well, we're not going to respond to rulemaking petitions that get filed. There are ways of delaying and drawing that out, but at the end of the day, there are ways of trying to force action. I would note, though, that an administration that really is interested in reform, if courts are serious about the sort of inquiries they engage in, or if they take Justice Kennedy's concurrence in Pereira in one of his last decisions where he lamented the way that Chevron and other administrative law doctrines are not uniformly or rigorously enforced by courts. But if courts do that, then I do think one possibility is you would see, at least in some areas, administrations realizing that their ability to adopt a particular type of reform agenda in a particular context is hampered by the obsolescence of the statute. We almost saw this in the Bush administration under the Clean Air Act. The Bush administration, as an initial matter, understood the whole premise of the Clear Skies proposal was that the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990 needed to be modernized to enable a more rational approach to many aspects of stationary source air pollution. And a fight over whether or not to include greenhouse gases in that ultimately prevented that legislation from going anywhere. And the Bush administration tried to do it unilaterally. And if you look at the record of Bush administration, Clean Air Act regulations in the DC circuit, you see one of the worst batting averages of any agency ever over any discrete time period. And so those sorts of episodes, I think, could, in the right area, lead an administration to at least support trying something like this in a particular context. And I think part of our hope is if you get that in one area and it works, then the willingness to replicate it across other subject matter areas might become easier once we've done it. We have a contemporary example of it working well.
The next question there, and then we'll have a question here in front.
Very quickly, great panel, everyone. A neat paper. My question is for Professor Bender. Philip's colleagues at the R Street Institute recently published a really great paper demonstrating that congressional staffing levels pale in comparison now relative to the past. My question is, do you think, oversight, we're talking about oversight, it's a function of capacity and expertise. Does Congress have the requisite capacity, the requisite staffing to exercise the sort of oversight we're talking about? And if not, if what they intimated in the study is true, what on earth is the incentive for Congress to not staff itself, to not give itself resources, for the purpose of overseeing the executive branch?
That is a great question, and it was a great study. I think first want to distinguish between different types of staffing and where Congress does staff up and where it doesn't. And party organizations get a lot of staffing, and CBO or GAO not so much. So I don't know that there's an aversion to staffing generally, but for sure, I agree that more staff judiciously appointed to the places that are hurting the most relative to what they want to do, more staff could indeed improve their capacity. I think sometimes I worry more about the CRS, GAO, CBO staffing, and cuts of those cuts have been uneven across those agencies, but in terms of doing the legwork of a legislative expertise, that's in part where you need to see it. Others would disagree and say you need to beef up professional staff on committees. I think everything's relative to what these committees want to do. Why Congress hasn't done that? There could be a partisan explanation here about differing views about how much capacity to give the Congress and how that capacity would be used. Some is a question of cost and the electoral perceptions of increasing the amount of money being spent on the legislature, the legislative branch. And some, I think, just to keep in mind, we are living under a world of the 2011 budget caps, and although they get raised, it is a Herculean every 2-year effort to figure out how far the caps are going up. But discretionary spending overall hasn't, it's not the merry 2000s anymore.
Can I add just one quick thing there? What I found fascinating when I was doing the legislative drafting one is how many agency officials are detailed to Congress, like hundreds a year. And they have to report how many a year. And it was interesting to see the agency's responses. If they wouldn't quite say we've got someone embedded in the, but like basically, right? Like we love to have, whenever the Farm Bill's up, the USDA has a number of people detailed to the committee. And I definitely think our proposal would end up beefing up authorizing committees quite significantly, both with detailees and with permanent staff. And that would definitely be one of the natural byproducts of forcing Congress to actually legislate. And they would look a lot different than the current kind of oversight staff that predominates a lot of these committees. They would be much more subject matter, legislative, policy expertise. So.
We have time for one last question.
Zoom out.
There it is.
Whoa. Elaine Middleman. And turning on the microphone, that's beyond my technical skills. This may not really be on point, but something was resonating in my mind. After the lovely Kelo decision, Congress, I don't know if it was a pronouncement, or I'm sure what the provision was, but they said federal funds should not be used for eminent domain. And I tried, because I was working on, still am, eminent domain, follow up on that, and whether they actually, I think they put it on a rider or something, but maybe just for 1 year, and then I could never really find out where, even though there was this huge outrage at the time, how that ever got put into any substantive provision that lasted maybe more than just that one budget cycle.
Well, I mean, sort of raises a broader question. If you had a choice what to sort of reform first in Congress, this is for everybody, would you reform the legislative process or the appropriations process? I mean, which really is the more practical or the more practically effective policymaking tool?
I would reform the legislative process first, because I think if you fix the legislative process, there's less pressure to distort the appropriations process. That is to say, the way I perceive some of what's going on, and Richard Lazarus, I know, has written some on this in the context of environmental law, is that the failure of Congress to regularly revisit substantive statutes doesn't relieve the pressure to try and influence what agencies do or don't do. And one way that manifests itself is increased pressure to use appropriations riders and the like as a way of getting at least temporary fixes. Now, their appropriations riders are more limited than direct legislation in terms of what you can and can't do. You typically have to say you can't spend money on X. It's much more difficult to give new authority to agencies or to change the scope of agency authority. But so at least my view is if Congress is more regularly revisiting the statutes, we're not going to see quite as much effort to use the appropriations process as a second best fix.
Sarah, do you want to jump in?
I guess I would just say I don't know that there's necessarily anything wrong with the rules of the game of the appropriations process. It's just the limited incentives to to comply with them.
Exactly.
Maybe that precipitates a desire to try to change the rules of the game, but unless lawmakers are going to buy into the new system, we're still left with a system that seems suboptimal.
Now, for a panel spent challenging and criticizing some aspects of what Congress does, I do want to take a moment at the end of the panel to thank the senator who made this all possible. Today's event is only possible because Senator Portman allowed us the use of this beautiful room, and we're very grateful for his office in making this happen. As you may have noticed, the room features not just a beautiful view out the back windows. There's a reason why we have you all face this way, or else you wouldn't hear anything in the panel. But on the walls are these details from the apotheosis of George Washington, the painting in the Capitol Rotunda. And so during the break, if you're interested in this, there's a guide on the wall over there that explains what all these beautiful pictures are behind us. But anyway, we're going to take a break now until 10:40, so you can all refill your coffee and your breakfast. But please join me very much in thanking both the discussants for the panel and the authors of this paper. Thank you very much.